curator at the JSMA Museum, and I welcome you here. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Oregon is located in Kalapua Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapua people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapua people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at the University of Oregon, across the land we now refer to as Oregon, and around the world. We see you. So again, greetings. It's great to be here. I want to acknowledge a few folks. First, I want to thank the School of Design and Art and the School of Art for their partnership with the museum. It's always great to work together. To Wendy Hellman, who's here, the program manager and organizer par excellence. Here, for her work in not just all the programs that she does, but in particular for organizing this one. We have other folks like Professor Ron Jude and John Weber from the museum here, and other faculty and staff and all the students, so welcome all. It's a pleasure to be able to honor and to introduce Lou Watts to you today. Louis is here in conjunction with the occasion of the recent opening of his exhibition, Likeness or Not, Reflections from the African Diaspora, at the JSMA, that runs through the summer until September 4th. The exhibition highlights an impressive grouping of photographs by Watts gifted to the museum, and it includes insightful and celebratory portraits of artists, activists, authors, and musicians, along with his photographs sourced from historical publications, some difficult to reconcile, yet important to face. As our time here is precious, allow me a few moments to highlight some of the biographical information for Louis, and then I'm going to present a short bullet list of what you need to know about Louis. So Louis Watts was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and raised in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. Educated in California with a BA in history and an MFA from UC Berkeley. He's been an educator for more than 40 years. He began at Berkeley and is a professor emeritus of art for the University of California, Santa Cruz. Watts has a long-standing interest in cultural landscape with emphasis on the African diaspora, U.S. and internationally. He is a keen and avid traveler and is photographed extensively throughout the United States and globally. I consider his lifelong gathering of material as a collection of strands of cultural DNA that he stitches together, creating a dialogue linking individuality to collective identity. He's the co-author with Elizabeth Pepin of the book Harlem of the West, the San Francisco Fillmore Jazz Era, made by Chronicle Books, and it consists of found photographs and oral histories of an African American community that sprang up as a result of the migration west during World War II, and it was urban renewed out of existence in the late 1960s in San Francisco. He's also the co-author with Professor Eric Porter of New Orleans Suite, Music and Culture in Transition from UC Press, dialogue of images and observations on New Orleans, both before and after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. His photography has been exhibited and may be found in the collections of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Ogden Museum of Southern Art, New Orleans, the Smithsonian Institution, the Oakland Museum of California, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and at the American embassies in Moscow, Prague, and at the Museum of the City in Paris, among other places. Now that's a lot of traveling, a lot of stitching. So Louis, in a short number of points, he is an enthusiastic, outgoing personality and is ubiquitously inquisitive, continuously making connections, conversation, and his mind doesn't sit still. He is first an historian by training and inclination, That means he sees what is before him, but also with eyes of a desire for understanding the breadth, depth, past, current, and possible in multiple combinations, along with how all moments, efforts, hopes, and realities collide endlessly, but meaningfully. In a way, history is a stack of experiences. He makes photographs not to possess what he pictures, but to share what he encounters with others. He's always been unfolding stories, attitudes, and family, both traditional and extended. And lastly, but perhaps foremost, relationships are at the root of, well, everything. Such a combination is a powerful tool when placed in the service of the muse and community. Please do welcome Lewis Watts.
Damn, I'm not supposed to follow that. Okay, thank you, Tom. Hi, everybody. Welcome. And I was going to say, to begin with, let's see if we're all on board. We are! Okay, good. It's no coincidence that I'm here. I have history with both John and Tom. John taught at he didn't teach, he was the head of the museum at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And Tom was the head of Photo Alliance, a photo organization in San Francisco that I was a board member for many years until I retired. That was the one thing I did when I retired, was resigned all my boards because I'd given at the office, so I'd done enough. But they're both, I was with them yesterday and felt really at home. And I feel pretty home here also because there's something about college towns that has connections. I've talked about that. And I'm both reassured by it and a little bit worried because I absolutely am tied to this environment. And I think that's a done deal. So I'm glad to be here amongst my friends and peers. So I was actually sort of wanted to talk a little bit about these two bodies of work, which maybe on the surface some of you may think, so what do they have to do with each other? Although no one's said that, so I think people are getting it. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about, as Tom said, I have a background in the Pacific Northwest, which I'm actually feeling really strongly because I haven't been up this way in a while. And it's making me think about kind of some things that formed who I am. So I think what I'll do is let's look at some pictures, and if anybody has questions, I guess you can shout them out, or we can maybe talk at the end, okay? So this is actually interesting. This is a photograph. Mr. Blunt, who was a good friend of my parents, had an Argus camera, and he photographed, and I didn't see it, I'd seen some of them, but when he died, his grandson found his archive. And this is a picture taken in 1950, at his yard, and you see in the background Lake Washington. And this is a picture of my parents, 4-year-old me, and my grandmother, Ethel Crenshaw, who had come 4 years after they had settled in Seattle to visit. There's another picture with some of their friends. Everybody that was in Seattle, especially coming because of the war, seemed to know each other. My father went to Morehouse College, and he knew all the Morehouse graduates, and my mother knew everybody from Arkansas because they really had this network. And so I thought, it was interesting that in 1950, people were settling in the West Coast, and this was kind of a phenomenon that happened in the middle of the 20th century. And let's see. So maybe a little bit later, when about 8 or 9, we were in Little Rock, and I asked my mother. I said, "You mean my grandfather was a minister, but he also had a tailor, and next door was a storefront church, and there were handmade signs. And my observation was, do you mean that the things I'm noticing here in Little Rock are not just limited to the Central District in Seattle?" And mother said, "Well, it had to come from somewhere." And that actually kind of, it's interesting, that resonates in my mind because it really has been the basis of a lot of the work I've done, this idea of what people brought with them, which influenced my life, and then what also remained and changed from where they came from. So that idea has been a sort of foremost in my practice. This is a photograph taken a little bit later. I think I'm probably 8 or 9, and that's my little brother Michael. And this is a picture of Mr. Blunt took, and I love that Hudson in the background. But these kids in line, I know still about 7 or 8 of them. Some of them live in the Bay Area. Some of them I know who are still in Seattle. And this was like a birthday party. We don't even know whose birthday it was, but that picture really resonates in that I lived in Seattle till I was 14, and yet there's a couple things. When I'm in Seattle, someone says, let's go to Ballard, I'll get in the car and drive right there, and I never drove in Seattle, but somehow it's implanted in my DNA because it's the first place that registered. So I kind of backed into photography. I was a political science and history major as an undergrad, and I think as a senior, you heard the story already, but I can repeat it. I transferred to UC Berkeley, and I had enough units in my major, but to graduate, I had to have sort of resident major. So I actually took the first art class I'd taken since middle school, and went, why have I not done this? I mean, it was because I really had loved it, taking art classes at the University of UW and different places, and really excelling at it or being very excited about it, but didn't do it all the way through high school. I think someone wanted me to go to college and succeed, I'm not sure. So for a minute I was going to do a double major, but this is in 1968 and the draft was looming, so I graduated and finished. And then was out for a year and worked for a filmmaker, someone who was doing political documentaries, and then got accepted to this really interesting graduate program in architecture that was for non-majors. It still exists at Berkeley, and it's the idea is that they wanted to broaden the discipline of people entering the profession. And I wasn't. I sort of backed into it. I thought maybe I can transition this or do it with city planning. But the other thing was, which is interesting, is we immediately started working in offices and designing, and it was really interesting to sort of hit the ground running with that. And you could take classes on campus. So I took a photo class, I think, in the middle of the first year, and 2 weeks in, said, this is what I want to do. It seemed like things came together. So one of the first places I went to photograph, once I decided, I took that photo class, I went to West Oakland because I saw in that landscape things that reminded me of growing up in Seattle. This picture on the left is interesting in that I found out later. At first, I saw the sign. And for those of you who know Walker Evans's work, he loves signs and tried to collect them. And I really was looking for the sign. But right after I took the picture, the people I think sold the house, and the sign disappeared. This photograph's in the collection at the Oakland Museum. So this was taken in West Oakland, and the picture on the right was taken. That one was taken in 1993, and the one on the left was taken, on the right was taken of the two women, probably in 1997 or 8. And this is actually in front of the new train station in Oakland, but it was indicative of stories I heard. People arriving there's this beautiful old Art Deco train station in Oakland, which is not used, but people talked about arriving with, $10 in their pocket and actually, being able to sort of find success in the Promised Land. The Promised Land was not always as promised as it was represented, but there were a lot of stories of people who came and did have success. So I thought that was actually indicative of this woman actually had come from the Central Valley in California for her daughter's wedding. But I love that idea of her being all dressed up. And both of these are kind of symbolic of this idea of things transferring. That what happened is the family that had the fresh killed poultry was from rural Louisiana, and there were when the shipyards were looking for people to work, and when sort of whole villages of rural Louisiana and Texas came west to the West Coast, including to Oregon and Washington. And someone obviously brought what they used to do at home, that you would raise chickens, and if you wanted fresh chickens, you would go as you would have in Louisiana. So this is actually another interesting picture taken in West Oakland. It turned out this raccoon belonged to the Middle East store owners that were sort of next door. And I had asked, and they had raised it, and I asked if I could photograph it, and they didn't want to, but this gentleman did. And so in the barbershop nearby, they were having bets about who would win in a fight between a pit bull and a raccoon. And I think most of the money was on the raccoon, actually. So this is the book that Tom referred to, Holland of the West. This is actually the cover of the 4th edition. And again, probably because Well, when I spent a summer in San Francisco in 1964, and someone said, "Do you want to go to the black area of San Francisco?" And I went to the Fillmore, and on a Friday night, and it was jammed. It was like this. What happened was this community was where San Francisco Japantown was, and so when the Japanese were interned, almost simultaneously, the shipyards in Vallejo and in San Francisco and in Sausalito and Richmond needed people to work because they were converting to the war effort. So they needed workers. And so a lot of people came from different parts of the country, but a lot of people came west especially from Texas and Louisiana. People know the book, The Wanted Other Sons by Isabel Wilkerson. It's basically a case study of these migrations throughout the 20th century. In this, the idea of the 40s and 50s, there was people that came west from primarily from that area, but also other parts of the country. So anyway, what happened was immediately people came to, and in San Francisco, the only neighborhood where there was housing or where black and people of color could live was this Fillmore, the Western Addition. And it had been an entertainment area, so almost immediately there were 10, 15, 20 clubs, jazz clubs, and it really was called the Harlem of the West. And here's a picture of Ella Fitzgerald in the basement of the Booker T. Washington Hotel. And actually, in that picture, if you look to the right of her, is Don Drysdale. It was a picture for the Brooklyn and the LA Dodgers, and next to him was Joe Perry, a running back. So this was like this prominent breakfast that was going on. And the thing I love about that picture is the Argyle socks of the guy on the right, and then that rug. So this was pretty cool. It's like people were having a great time. And then this is a picture taken by David Johnson, who is actually the last living photographer. He came to the San Francisco Art Institute to study, which had a different name then, but he studied with Ansel Adams from Florida. And he was the first black person to study with Ansel, and then opened up a studio in the Fillmore district. And so this is actually a really interesting record shop where people could buy jazz and rhythm and blues. That he took in the late 1940s. And actually, when I go back, he has an exhibit opening at the San Francisco Art Commission at 97, which I think will be really exciting. And I had to be back for that because he wouldn't forgive me. And then, so the other thing is all these clubs, some people were self-taught and were hired by the clubs to photograph the performers and the customers. And what they would do is, a lot of times they would photograph and then at 2 or 3 in the morning, go home, develop the film, make prints, and come back at 4 in the morning and sell the prints to the people. So some of those went into the collections of some of the club owners, and I was able to find some of them. And in fact, I learned Photoshop restoring some of these photographs. This is like one of those things, there's people in the room that can relate to the fact that in the mid-90s, there were a number of photographers who, I was very comfortable in the dark room, and this digital thing was looming, but I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And I even took Photoshop, but I wasn't teaching it, and I didn't have to use it. And in fact, I was teaching in the College of Environmental Design, and architecture was one of the first people to do computer graphics and digital graphics. So I had some graduate students when I needed something digitized that would help me. And I remember somebody saying, "Could you help me with this work?" And fortunately, someone said, "No, you need to do it yourself." So when I was invested in it, I learned it immediately and more readily, and that's what happens. You need to be, and so it changed my own career, but also I was able to sort of bring some of this work back. So from there, we'll jump ahead to this archive and book. I was at the Amistad Center for Art and Culture, which is a museum and cultural center in Hartford, Connecticut, where I've shown work and done some work. And I was in the office of one of the curators, and there was a stack of books, and I picked up one of the books at the top, and it was a first edition by Frederick Douglass from 1850. Just absolutely beautiful and showing the age. And I said, what is this? I was all excited. And he said, well, this is our archive, and we're having artists to respond to the work. And immediately when he said that, I said, I want to do it. And I knew that I wanted to reproduce that work, so people could access it. And I was just interested. A lot of these books were from a time when that was the only way you got information. There was not movies, there wasn't recordings. There probably was some recordings, but it was interesting that books, both as objects of desire as well as information, were just these incredible objects. So this is the one that I saw, and I just, that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed human being in the world in the 19th century. I mean, it was like, so he knew, I mean, it was interesting, he, not too long after the invention of photography, he knew the power of the image and used it all through his career. And he wasn't bad looking. He knew he used his assets. So there's all these really interesting books, of different kinds of resonance. But I was just interested in kind of how they were rendered and how the covers were. And I have a number of versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and then these really gold leaf, just beautiful gold leaf, as ways to illustrate. Here's one of Sojourner Truth. Some of you know this movie, 12 Years a Slave, and this was from the original of the book. And, there was photography may or may not have existed, but it was really difficult to reproduce it. So there are all these incredible wood blocks and other technology. And I think it's interesting that what digital has done now is allowed some of those earlier technologies to have rebirth, cyanotypes and all kinds of things. And then just as objects, these just incredibly beautiful, and I think you'll see a picture of a really big print I did of this one that sort of reproduced, because this is my abstract expressionist thing of history. And then Crisis was the publication that W.E. Du Bois did for the NAACP, and he used, it was a monthly, I think, and he used authors, famous artists of the time, to illustrate them. In fact, someone looked it up. This artist was actually from Iowa, the Midwest, and did a lot of work for left-wing and African American causes in New York. And it's really beautiful and sort of reflects the time and the date. And then, the idea of the book in various forms, and I love that the one way to protect the photograph, it would have that sort of basically the sheeting over it. In some cases, I photographed it over the text. In some cases, you'll see I photographed it over the image as just a way of reflecting how the book would both work as a protective device, but also just the way you could access the imagery. So this one was interesting. I was just talking to someone about it. Someone gave me this book, a German copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And if you look closely, the figures have black skin, but they actually have European features. I think the Germans didn't know how to render people of African descent, so I thought that was really interesting. And then this is in the exhibit. This is a book from the 50s, actually, by Langston Hughes. The first book of jazz, and it's sort of the style represents the time. It's a little more reflecting kind of mid-20th century aesthetic. And a book that's actually been really important to me was a book that Roy Akerov and Langston Hughes did. This is actually, so I've been doing research in the Schomburg Library in Harlem. There's a great African American library in Oakland, and there's an Amistad and Tulane in New Orleans. And in some cases, it's funny, the Schomburg, they won't let me scan them, so I have some things that I'm sending in there. I haven't gotten it together, but I have been scanning it. But I was really interested. This is the original sort of first copy of The Sweet Flypaper of Life that they collaborated on. And then another kind of earlier version of this collaboration called Harlem Story, which was, I think, may have happened before the book. And then I was in New York. This is maybe March of 2019 or 18. And I was actually in Brooklyn, and I crossed the street, and there was two big posters kind of advertising, I think there's a new edition of this book. But I thought what was interesting is the poster had survived the winter in New York and sort of showed that, and I thought it was sort of symbolic of how this book has endured. And the poster endured the New York winter, and so did the book. This is actually from the Oakland Library. And there's a photograph by, I can't remember the photographer. Can you see who it is? If you will see here, let's see. Yeah, Jill Crimmins, yes. Again, I love, it may be, there's some of these may border a little bit on stereotype, but these wood blocks are just absolutely beautiful. And I think, there was a way, this is the inside cover. And here's one illustrating this, the story of Stagger Lee. And then, in this same collection where these, this is actually a game, the Little Black Sambo game, and a number of images and books that I think, well, it was interesting to me that they would be in this black cultural institution, because probably the only other place you would find these books might be in private Southern libraries, although I'm not sure, I haven't seen them anywhere else. And there was no doubt about scanning them, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to show them, But it seemed like the dialogue, and I thought the dialogue was really interesting, and the fact that the source came from the same place, even though the books were. The other thing that this sort of showed, this was actually a card game, was how hard somebody was working to sort of foment white supremacy, and to sort of fool a certain segment of the population into thinking, even though their lives were not that good, they sort of could have the myth that maybe they're better off than the black folks. And then these sort of really interesting ads. Someone said that they've seen Darky toothpaste in Japan still for sale, which I thought was interesting. I think this is the inside of the Little Black Sambo, but I can't remember. So I presented it in different versions, but what was interesting, and I think originally, was I printed these on kind of handmade paper to kind of reference the original materials, and it's nice we have the ability to do that. And so I thought it would be interesting to see, because it's interesting that in the exhibit in the museum they sort of have a little different resonance, but I think they work both ways. So it was interesting. I'm really interested in kind of the power of photographs, and also interested in pictures. I've been looking at Billie Holiday for many years. So I've been collecting these photographs because it seems to me that she looks different in almost every photograph I've ever seen. She's like, how this idea that whether you capture somebody or not. I'll just sort of, this is kind of the thing, finding images, collecting them, and then also worrying about, I haven't exhibited this a lot, but worrying about copyright and things like that. This is Billie Holiday. You should look her up. You should know. If you don't know who she is, you should know. I hope people in this room know. She was like probably one of the most famous African American singers of the 20th century, and had a really, well, you'll see, she had a very interesting and complicated life, and she was very good friends with Lester Young. They did a lot of duets together. She also had trouble with the law. She had an ongoing drug problem. But it's funny, she spent time in the Fillmore, and people told me that when they'd see her on the street, it didn't matter what kind of shape she was in. She was so beautiful, everybody's mouth dropped open, and I think that seems obvious. Here she is doing sort of recovery, and you see here she's with a pose with a picture of Louis Armstrong. And her trademark was the gardenias in her hair. And I think what's interesting to me is it sort of speaks to the veracity of photographs too. That here's someone you see looks like from image to image really look different, and I thought that was really interesting as just talking about the sort of and how it reflects sort of parts of her life, and if you know her art, how it's respected. This is actually photographed by Jerry Stoll, who was a San Francisco photographer. This was, I think, taken at the Monterey Jazz Festival. But what's interesting is when that Chihuahua died, she had the dog buried with the mink coat she's wearing, which I thought was pretty interesting in itself. So this is kind of what I was just interested in, kind of that. I think this is reflecting the thing that I've been examining. So that kind of then gets us to these portraits. How are we doing? I think we're doing all right. Okay. And I would say, I think Tom actually asked me, he said, well, some of these are posed and some seem to be more casual. And I would say the source of these are usually me photographing some other event. you'll see examples of the Afro Punk, which is this festival that was started in Brooklyn by black skater kids, and now it's like in Brooklyn, it's like Coachella. There's 300,000 or 400,000 people that go to it, and I photographed one in Paris and I photographed one in Atlanta, and I was interested in kind of this, the people that were going and kind of what they look like, and realized there was. I think one day I had some big paper and I kind of was printing some of the things and realized, oh, there's something going on with these portraits, which is sort of. What was going on was it seemed to be pictures of people who are comfortable in their skin. Some people are also better known. Angela Davis taught at Santa Cruz, and in fact, a friend of mine who was a curator lives in Berlin, but a curator in Dresden. Eastern Germany actually had these campaigns that supported, when she was in prison, supported her being released. And so they had an exhibit of kind of her impact and images. And originally they wanted me to photograph her when she was speaking internationally and some of the people that were in the audience. But then the COVID happened and she wasn't doing it. So she's very hard to get a hold of, you can imagine. I finally was able to convince her that, all these great murals have gone up in Oakland, and so she let me photograph her in front of some of those, and that's what some of these are about. I thought this was interesting because this sort of speaks about both her past and her present, in terms of the conditions and maybe the future. And then this is actually from something called a Black Joy Parade, which I photographed a couple of years, and I was just interested in kind of people in celebration and kind of the way they're doing the stories. And the same thing, this is, what's his name? Bicycle. This is Betty Reed Soskin, who was the oldest living ranger in Oakland. There's a Rosie the Riveter Memorial Park in Richmond where I live, and she just retired at 100 a couple of months ago. And her family was from Louisiana, but came in the 20s actually. And I've had the opportunity to photograph her. And even I think this was at 98. She's like chic and one of the sharpest people, really beautiful person. So I've been really kind of fortunate to add her to the collection. Some of you know, this is Daoud Bey. This is actually, Daoud's a big jazz fan. When he comes to San Francisco, this is in front of SF Jazz, the building, because we went to see some music together. He's an old good friend of mine. This is my friend Adia, who's a great artist. This was actually an Afro Punk in Paris, and I liked him and I loved his shirt, so I had to take that picture and include it. And this is Teju at actually an art opening. I think this was actually Daoud's opening, but I love that she's wearing her Kodachrome earrings. Or maybe they're Ektachrome earrings. This is actually Bayou, and this was taken in his studio in Havana. And the only thing I really wish I'd gotten some of his paintings. I really liked his work and said, I can't get him home or something, but I'll have to go back when it opens up. This is Afro Punk in Atlanta. This is the Black Joy Parade in Oakland. And this is actually in the Sebastopol region of Paris. I have a series and this is taken in Paris too. I was in Paris when I was an undergrad, and it wasn't very diverse. And then didn't go to Europe for 4 years. I was photographing in the Western Hemisphere mostly. But when I went to a Black Arts conference, at first I took the train from Charles de Gaulle into Paris, and it was like taking the A train. At every stop, the Moroccans would get off at one stop, the West Africans, which is just like when you take it from New York, the A train from New York. So I said, something's changed here. And as a result now, this was in 2013, I've been back about 15 times because I was really interested in the kind of black presence mostly in Paris, but also other parts of France and also Europe. This is Luis Mendez, who is the most photographed photographer in the world. He hangs out by B&H in New York and uses his speed graphic and shoots Polaroids and is doing it for many years. And a lot of people photograph him because he sort of looks like a contemporary of the people that were using the speed graphics in the Fillmore. This is Lana Turner, who's a cultural icon in Harlem, who I've gotten a chance to meet and photographed. She's a pretty amazing person, and this is in her flat in Harlem. It's not her apartment yet. This is Paris. This is two artists, actually, in front of an opening in, I think, Newark, New Jersey. And I'm sort of interested in that kind of combination. And I'm sort of curious, if you think, what do you think connects this work? Most of them pretty good looking, right? But I think there is some, that's what I thought. There is some quality in terms of what they're presenting, that they're not letting someone else define who they are. This is actually during Carnival in Santiago de Chile. No, Santiago de Cuba. No, Chile is Cuba. They have a carnival in the middle of summer because there's also a religious ceremony that's around it, and I think it has something to do with the planting season, too. These were two Haitians I took at an opening in Harlem. This is Omar Victor Diop, who's an incredible photographer from Kenya. I photographed this in Florence during a Black Arts Conference. I'm trying to, he says I can come to Kenya and photograph, so I'm working on that because I want to do that. This is Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Information for the Black Panthers, who's actually an internationally known artist. He was did a lot of the illustrations for the Black Panther publication and is still working and continuing. Sam Wooten, who actually his father was a black GI and his mother was French, and he was raised near Cherbourg in Normandy, but spent many years in San Francisco, although has now moved back to France. And this is down the street from where he grew up, in this castle. This is Delphine, who's in the show. She's an art historian. And this was taken in Oakland in front of one of the murals that have sprung up. What happened in Oakland was there was sort of demonstrations, a lot of windows were broken. And then when the plywood went up, people started doing all these incredible murals, which I think it sounds like it's happening here, too. This is Henry Louis Gates in a lighter mood. This was actually at it was a Black Arts conference that Deborah Willis, some of you know, organizes, and this one was at Harvard, although this was actually at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Boston, with that wall that I had to use as a backdrop for a lot of people, because it seemed like it worked. This is Afro-Punk in Paris. This is actually at the African American Art and Culture Complex in San Francisco, and two twins who are artists took it over, and so they were doing a lot of murals. Actually, when the COVID hit, they're now doing a lot of murals outside in the parking lot. But someone was commenting, what they noticed in this picture is it's sort of in ways hard to see where he ends and the painting begins, because he's got paint on his, which I hadn't noticed before. That's good. That's why I show it to other people. And this was kind of one of the versions of, actually when I was in Boston, it was sort of, it's funny, I think she's from Toronto, and I was really interested when I'm in the winter in the East. I love those coats that we don't see out here. You may see maybe a little bit more here, but there's, like in Canada, they have to really ratchet up their coat aesthetic, which I think is actually very cool. So this was actually the portrait book that I did. I used her as the cover. This is a friend of mine, artist, who's from the Horn of Africa, who I photographed on a number of occasions. So I like that idea of having, this is an installation she did behind her. This was taken in Brooklyn. This is actually in Sebastopol in Paris, and he was rocking his Timberlands, and I was thinking, what is the main import of American culture? And it's hip-hop all over the world. This is an artist in a studio he had in Oakland. This was actually a dance and movement group, and they were doing sort of a performance on Market Street in San Francisco, kind of talking about the Middle Passage and things passing, and kind of dressed in period, but moving through the financial district of San Francisco, which I thought was really interesting. This is Afro-Punk in Atlanta. This is Atlanta also. This is Atlanta. It was interesting. Atlanta, I didn't know what to expect, and Atlanta was pretty wild. I think this has partly to do with the climate. The fact it's warm enough that people, and there's a critical mass and a really large kind of black bohemian population, so they were there. And what's nice in Afropunk, they have things divided up with these sort of curtains of fabric, so I had these natural backdrops, which I could sort of use. This was actually in Paris, in Ménilmontant. This is actually a friend of mine, JR, who's a poet, and this was taken in the Czech Republic at Barbara's, the art mill. And here's your Portland, Oregon's own Carrie Mae Weems rocking. This is Atlanta also. This was actually a refugee camp in the middle of Paris. I was interested, and I've been showing a lot of them, but I photographed, as part of that idea about migration, photographing people in many ways who had really struggled to get to Europe, and then the struggle they were going once they got there in terms of being uprooted, sort of like with the homeless happening here. But I like that picture both symbolically and kind of for what it was. Okay, and then so the latest thing that I've been working on is a good friend of mine, Walter Hood, who's a landscape architect who I taught with at Berkeley, is designing an African American museum in Charleston, South Carolina. I had been to Charleston and photographed it like 20 or 30 years ago, but I had an opportunity to go there multiple times, and I've been really interested in this place that's very culturally rich. It's a part of the South that I don't have any relatives and didn't know a lot about, but being connected with the museum has opened all kinds of doors for me. The museum actually is supposed to now open. It's been delayed. It's supposed to open in January of 2023, or next January. So these are earlier pictures. I took this one last month, so it's progressing. And I think he did a lot of this landscaping. And the people are really excited about it because I think just like the Smithsonian African American, it's both a kind of a centering point for culture and gathering, and also a place to sort of really represent the history of this and the Gullah culture. I love this sort of cutouts. So I've had the opportunity. This is actually Mother Emanuel. Some of you know we were just talking about upstate New York. There was just a mass killing in Buffalo. But Mother Emanuel, where a young man went and actually joined a prayer circle with elders from the church, and when they were done, he pulled out his gun and shot most of them. And so, on the one hand, I was interested about the place, but I was also sort of hesitant to even go. I mean, I was wondering, but it turns out this is like a couple years later. This is one of the largest black churches in the South, in the country, actually, and that's what was. It was not the tragedy, but as a cultural and spiritual center. It was that seemed to resonate and kind of overshadowed the other history. And then there's this whole tradition of sweetgrass weaving, which also Native Americans do out here, but it also happens in West Africa. So this Gullah culture. I don't know if some of you know in Cuba there's something called the Maroons, some slaves who escaped and were able to sort of keep their culture alive. And the Gullah culture in this part of the South sort of is analogous to that, where on some of the islands people still have African dialect in their language. The song Kumbaya comes from Gullah and has a West African meaning. So there's something called a Sweetgrass Highway that has all these stands, and it used to be all of them were filled, and a lot of the older people who did the baskets are dying out, and they widened the highway, so it made it harder for people to stop. But I was able to, finally, this is my third trip, and I kept saying, damn, I have to get a basket, so I was able to buy one from this woman who's weaving. And actually the habitat's disappearing because of, growing of things. And also it's the diet of manatees, and manatees are under threat because they've had to feed them artificially, like to find places to feed them because their natural habitat. This is actually interesting, a school that this was where it was, I don't think this was the original site, but this was a one-room segregated school that I talked to a number of people who went to, and it had been abandoned for like 20 years, and they were going to tear it down, and someone sort of rescued, and they got moved to Snowden, which is one of the communities, and they're in the process of now kind of restoring it, and I think they're going to make it into a cultural center. The other thing is this land is incredibly beautiful. It's funny that I didn't really appreciate it because they call it the Low Country because it really is flat. And the only way you sort of know that it's surrounded by water is there's a couple of really big bridges that sort of put the Golden Gate to shame. And these bridges go over the waterway, and that's the only place you can get high enough to see that there's all this really beautiful kind of wetlands and so that's been really interesting. And we were just talking about the clouds in Oregon, the great clouds in South Carolina too. The only place that doesn't have interesting clouds most of the time is Northern California. Although recently they've been pretty good. I've been able to do that. So it's interesting that the one thing that I was able to put in touch with is there's these communities that were in a place called Mount Pleasant. And they said they wanted me to stay there, and I went, and it was like being in Marin County. I said, why are they staying here? But this is where the plantations were, and when the Civil War began, a lot of the land was given to the slaves. When Reconstruction, some of it was taken away, but in what I've done, there's a number of communities where people have thrived, and these communities have existed since 1860, 1865, and in some cases are doing very well. And one of the things that was obvious, and I had some relatives that attest to that, there's a reason some black people didn't leave the South because they didn't have to. They were actually able to thrive even in the midst of segregation. So that's been really interesting and maybe a story that not everybody knows. And this was like in the back of this Snowden, and it was sort of a family compound. So some members of the family went away to New York and kind of made their fortune, and when they retired, they came back. And in this whole community, there's houses that look like, I would compare them to Scarsdale and other affluent suburbs, which you sort of don't think of as sort of surprising. This is actually a plantation that at about 1859 or something, somebody was inherited and they squandered the money, and so they were responsible for the largest sale of slaves sort of in the history of the country because of somebody messing up financial-wise. And it's called the Weeping Time. It happened in Savannah. And this is actually on the coast, sort of southeast of Savannah. And this was the site of that plantation, which I think it's the same thing. I think they're making it into a park. But it was interesting because I photographed the Weeping Times, which I didn't, not showing you here. This is a statue of Denmark Vesey, and he led a rebellion, and in fact sort of confronted people in front of the Citadel. And so this statue is kind of a celebration honoring him. And originally they wanted to put it right in front of the Citadel, and they were not having that in South Carolina. But it's prominent in a major park in Charleston. And he was also a builder and kind of a jack of all trades, so I think that's what that represents. And this is actually, I went to a number of the farmers markets, and someone said, you should see this gentleman. And I went out to his farm on John's Island, which is one of the islands, and he supplies fruit and produce up and down the East Coast. He's got like 50 acres and is really prolific. And he said, you taught at Santa Cruz? And I said, yeah. He says, I took organic farming there. I almost fell over. He's like, 80 years old, but that's what he farms organically and, really taking advantage of it and had enough sense to know. So that's one of the centers of it where it's being studied. And then this is actually another woman with a farm the climate there is a little different than here. So their vegetables and fruit comes forth a little sooner than us and a little sooner than you. So that's been really interesting. I'm in the midst of that, and I'm going to go back in the fall. Someone said, well, you should come in July. And I said, no, I don't think so. July is a little too hot and humid to run around. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you, and what I was hoping from this to sort of provide some context for those two bodies of work in the exhibit, and you can sort of see a variety of other things I'm interested in. So actually, I did faster than I thought. Sometimes I talk too long, but if anybody has questions or wants to see some other images, I'd be very happy to answer to them. And thank you again for all for coming. And like I said, I'm very happy to be in Eugene. There was some talk amongst my colleagues from the Bay Area about maybe I'll be moving here, so I don't know. We'll see what happens. I certainly will come back and visit, that's for sure. Actually, because people in Charlotte, thank you. Yes. Okay. I think what's interesting is, and I think that's someone was asking me today about how do you photograph people in places you don't know. And I actually have this radar that sort of tells me if I'm on my game or not. It doesn't necessarily correlate with whether I'm actually doing good work, but there's sometimes I'll be someplace and I'm not exactly sure why I am, or I'm taking it for granted, like, oh, I photographed here before. And the percentage of people will say, no, you can't take my picture, goes way up. And when I'm kind of really in the midst of something, whether it's new or old, people seem to pick up on that, and it's a good marker. If there's somebody doing a drug deal says, yeah, sure, photograph. I said, maybe I'm onto something. So it's interesting to have that as a indicator, and also this idea that on the one hand, sort of photographing strangers in the world, you think, oh, you get used to it, but it's always something you have to kind of build up to. Actually, photographing landscape too, and so what I like is, I sort of get some momentum going, and it's really exciting. And I love teaching, and I love teaching informing my own work. And now that I'm not teaching, although even today I was meeting with students, and it scratched an itch, and I think it was great. That all connects, and I think it's all about it connects to my process and other people's process, and so that's really exciting to me. So that's my story. If anybody has some questions or comments, yes.
I have a question. You're gathering all this material.
Yes. Yeah.
And we do have a show across the way that's like 20 prints.
Yes. Yes.
And this sort of clamors for something bigger.
Well, yes. Yes.
Planning a book or
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I am probably planning another some books and also some larger exhibits. I'm hoping that this South Carolina work will go into that museum. It seems like the perfect thing, and I'm getting positive. But I said not yet. I want to go 2 more times, but I think maybe not when it opens, but maybe we'll see. I'm just playing it by ear. And it's funny that Hung Lu, who's prominently in the museum, was a member. She was affiliated with the Rena Bronstein Gallery, which I am in San Francisco. So, I was heartbroken when she died, but I was thrilled to see such a large body of work, and some work by her I'd never seen before. And I love it. It's no coincidence. The sort of connections has to do with my connections here. So that was thrilling. And I was going to say that I was really impressed with what I saw in the museum. There's an Angela Davis show at the Rutgers Museum in New Jersey. And after seeing that exhibit, I sort of did a tour of the other work. And I think everybody is sort of taking out all the stops because, museums and places that show art were closed for a long time. So I think people are really kind of using this opportunity to both look at what's in their collection, but also make sure that they're sort of showing work to sort of make up for lost time, which is really pretty exciting. Yeah. Yes.
It's really fun seeing so many of your pictures all at once.
I was hoping not too many, but yeah.
And I was thinking about that. The more of the street portraits and things, all the portraits, they kind of pick up a kind of momentum.
Mm-hmm.
As you see more and more of them. And I was thinking about that, and also thinking about that in relation to your, starting out as studying history.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about how, in some sense, your photographic practice is also very much a sort of a history practice.
Yeah.
And self-consciously so. And that's one of the threads that I see connecting the different bodies of work, and it is really interesting seeing the Billie Holiday stuff.
Yeah. I was sort of, and things, are they a distraction? No. I mean, I think it all relates in that there's some things that I'm thinking about And that sort of gathering becomes a way to sort of manifest it, which is good, I think. Yeah, I mean, you can see.
It would be cool to see that as like a piece, but I get the copyright.
Right. A lot of the photographers are dying out, so maybe they'll be all right later. We'll see. If anybody knows a good lawyer.
But, I think all the individuals listing in the grid.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah. It's funny, I've done a grid that was not so organized, and it was interesting to sort of think about different ways to present that work, in relationship to each other. I mean, and I think all that, sort of is a way of manifesting how I'm thinking about the work, and then presenting as another way of sort of I don't have to bring it to a conclusion, but just realizing there's ways that you can render what I've been thinking about. I mean, that's what I think we do as artists all the time. Yeah.
So much of photographic training is often, sort of pressure to have a style.
Right.
And thinking about, let's think of photography as history.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
As a history practice.
Yeah.
Is a way to liberate yourself from that in some way. And taking on this terrain of the Afro-punk, sort of cultural figures, and thinking about that, it sort of reorganizes the way one thinks about what does it mean to be, quote, a photographer. It's sort of thing and has some sort of almost boundaries that maybe haven't always been directed.
Yeah, no, always. But I think it's all, even when it doesn't work, there's things to be learned from that. It doesn't work in quotes, It's interesting, that book I showed you, I think I originally published in 2019, maybe 20, I can't remember. I did 2 versions of it. Yeah, but since that time, I've done about 400 more works. So there's, I think there's more volumes to come. And I'm trying to decide whether to do one big one or just do them in segments. But we'll see.
I know you did a lot of work in refugee camps in Europe.
Yes.
And I think you could talk a little bit about that work and where it is. And if, I don't know, I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Real preoccupation.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I've shown that work both here and in Europe, actually. It's been interesting. And it's interesting that I was in a show. There's a whole connection between France and New Orleans for obvious reasons. And I went to this kind of this festival that was sort of celebrating the brass band tradition, which actually the French brought to New Orleans. The French let the slaves play music, which a lot of the English did not do in the rest of the South. So that's partly why jazz developed. So one of the sort of this is in Rennes in Brittany, and one of the best known brass bands there went to New Orleans to study, and then I was invited to show work from New Orleans at this festival they were having in Brittany, and they brought a couple of the cultural leaders and musicians from New Orleans there, and which was really interesting. And so one of the honorariums, I should have talked about this here, they said, you can go anywhere you want in France. What would you like to do? And I said, I heard there's this refugee camp in Calais. And so I went to Calais, and fortunately I went and I had a connection with an NGO there, as well as So this is like the word was, if you could get to England, it was easier to get papers, and it was more work. So people were sort of going to Calais to get on to the channel, but before I got there, the French had paid the English to make fences on the border, which looked very much like the fences in Tijuana. There must be a border fence protection aesthetic. It was really interesting. But when I went, they said it was the most sort of smoothly run refugee camp, and mostly self-governed, and they were taking care of trash. They had medical facilities. A lot of times, and people would come because if you were from Serbia or someplace, there'd be a group of Serbians there, and a lot of West Africa and a lot of Syrians. And when I went, it was like really smooth. Although when we were there, the French gendarmes showed up, and we asked the army. They said, "What's going on?" It was strictly routine, but the refugees said they had never seen them before. And it turned out not too long after that, they tear gassed and tried to wipe out, tried to make the people move. Although it was really dumb. They put them in buses and dropped them off, 10 miles away, and they all came back. I think it's still vestiges of it, but they did get smart enough to take some of them and actually place them in places around France where they could have protection. But it's not, the French did not really know what to do with the things. And the English, obviously, their decision was to block it off. And people were, getting killed trying to jump on the back of lorries and things. So it was a mess. But it's sort of for the same reason. Some of it was to escape oppression and war, and some of it was for economic opportunities, which was the same reason people migrate, for the history of time. Anybody else? Well, maybe we're done. We can all go have a drink. Can we go have a drink? Thank you very much, really. Yeah. What I did want to say one last thing, that the most important thing, I'm probably going to reveal stuff, about doing these things is it makes me put my ducks in a row. And it makes me think about, if I have to talk about it, I got to think about what the hell it is I'm doing, which becomes really valuable for me to kind of think, where am I going to progress from here? And I was going to say, if you have an opportunity to do that, like in crits, I was talking to some of the students today, and I have to say, I taught in the College of Environmental Design, which I think is in Berkeley, which is analogous where we are, but in Berkeley. But in Santa Cruz, I taught in the art department. And I'm going to go to Portland in a couple of days, and I know 5 or 6 students who are doing very well. Some of them are now being artists. And when I go to New York, I know 40. And Santa Cruz, compared to Berkeley, was maybe a little less cosmopolitan students, at least when they come. They're more suburban. But they learn how to make community. They learn how to sort of deal with reduced resources. They learn how to talk about what they're doing in the critiques. And those are skills that you don't always get in, say, business and science. And so those skills translate to a variety of ways, and people know that somehow if you're able to communicate it. And so I would say, if your parents are complaining because you're an art major, just tell them you're getting skills you're not getting as a physics or a scientist. I don't know if that's going to work, but we take good luck. Whoops. Okay. Thank you again.